For more than 3 years, no one had knocked on my door, and I like living that way. The only place on earth that ever made me feel safe was the house my mother left me, alone. It wasn't because of a high fence or a sturdy deadbolt, but because she breathed in this house. She was The house was located on the northern outskirts of Tacoma and was the only woman who ever placed me first. Although it wasn't opulent or worth $1 million, Washington was my mother created the castle as a legacy by working long hours, skipping treatments, and using every penny she had saved to purchase every brick in this house. I was just 24 when Mom died of heart failure. And since then, this house hasn't I prepared coffee every morning since it was all I had left of her where I lived. Gazing out into the garden she'd planted with rosemary and the small kitchen where she used to hum while cooking. She used to read me stories as a child, and every evening I sat by the attic window. Every brick, every brook murmured the same message she left on the floorboards. Don't allow anyone take this space away from you, Natalie. I fulfilled my commitment, and I believed it would be I made just enough money at a modest downtown office, doing a reliable accounting job. I lived well enough on my own without assistance, and I would have wanted to keep my private life. I was mature enough to understand that tranquility was something you had to defend carefully. The only person Unfortunately, my biological father, Thomas Harris, was the one who might wreck that. Be a composed man. Before he divorced my mother and wed the blonde Rebecca, a woman who spoke in a sugar-coated voice that made your skin crawl and wore excessive amounts of cosmetics, had a daughter. Haley, who is 4 years younger than me, was so pampered that she thought everything my father never called until he needed something, and he never showed up at my college. Life should belong to her. My birthday wasn't called for by graduation, and he didn't call after my mother died. Even go to the memorial service. Instead, he sent a printed note and a bouquet of flowers. The Harris family sent me their sympathies. I wasn't related to them, and they weren't mine, at least not until they unexpectedly appeared, refusing to check in. But my father called me one Thursday afternoon to make a demand. Was working on quarterly reports. He had never phoned me in the middle of the week unless there was an emergency, so I stopped what I was doing and took up Natalie, his voice low and purposefully soft. "Shall we meet?" I stated frankly, "What is it that we need to talk about as a family this weekend? It's not something to go." Rebecca and Haley would also be present via the phone. Hearing that made my throat clench. That kind of family. Every conversation was a secret word for something I didn't want to hear. That weekend, I arrived at his house as scheduled, and as soon as I entered, I noticed Haley sitting at the kitchen table with a noticeable pregnant tummy. She grinned at me like we were closest friends back then, hiding behind a tight ash-gray garment. She flipped her hair and adopted the weary expression of a mother to pass for Illy. My half-sister, whom I was never her partner, Mason, was 6 months pregnant, and she was now 26. A few months ago, Rebecca, whom I had only met briefly at a Christmas party, left her following a public Facebook meltdown, placed a cup of herbal tea in front of me and motioned for me to sit down, her eyes glimmering as she spoke. "Haley really needs a stable place to stay," she said, expressing the greatest affection. "Our living room is already occupied by the nursery, and our flat is too small. According to the doctor, stress is unhealthy for the baby, and because the due date is approaching, we genuinely have no other choice." Remained quiet, thinking that something wasn't right, and then my father remarked in a gentle tone like he was attempting to comfort the child. "You live alone in that large home, you're single, and you have no children, so perhaps it's time to—" I scowled as I thought of sharing that room for something bigger. "Sharing what do you mean, specifically?" That Haley looked up, speaking for the first time. "Sharing, I mean if I were able to move in, it would be better for you, the infant, and me. You're self-sufficient, correct?" I looked to my father icily. "Are you really going to give Haley Rebecca my mother's house?" she asked, jumping in right away. "No one is stealing anything. However, if you could temporarily relocate into a smaller apartment, then Haley may provide the secure setting she need." Where would I live? We've already identified a number of excellent possibilities for you, Rebecca said as she took a stack of printed listings of one-bedroom apartments in downtown Tacoma out of her purse. Your work is really reasonably priced, and it's a fresh start. Isn't it exciting? I responded slowly. That house belongs to my mother, as if I had just been slapped with the papers. She left it to me to keep my voice steady, not to your side of the family. My father turned away, and Haley said nothing but the words, "You could make me homeless." Don't be selfish, Natalie, she advised me, her smug expression telling me everything. Haley is carrying a life. Can't you sacrifice a life? Rebecca remarked, emphasizing each syllable. Bit for family? Family, I said, getting up from the chair. Scraping the floor. If making a sacrifice means sacrificing the only thing my mother left me, then no, I can't. Nobody said a word as I left that house, but I knew the tale wasn't finished since I had seen it in the expression in Haley's eyes. Was not one of someone in need of assistance, of someone who had been accustomed to using a pout to achieve anything she wanted, and I was correct. The true storm was only just getting started. Less than 3 days later, I received a note from my father that wasn't an apology, or perhaps a link to a news article about generational differences and familial ties, sacrifice. A brief message was included. You should read it. There is a lot to consider. Before I could reply, Rebecca called and said, Sweetheart, excessively charming voice. Family is sacred. No one can live forever just for themselves. I clenched my jaw at that line. If your mother were still here, she would want you to do the right thing. I could now plainly see that their preferred emotional weapon was that they were still alive. They had no plans to retreat, and Haley continued to be quiet save for her. Every time I went to my dad's house to get documentation or signatures, she was more obnoxious than words. One hand on her belly while she sat on the couch with her feet pushed up on a cushion. Rebecca had prepared a glass of lemonade for her, and every time when she entered, she would give out that hazy smile that was part challenge and half greeting. She never stated outright that the mansion would be hers, but the way she gazed at me as though she was oppressive and waiting for me to give up. On Friday, I returned home from work and discovered a glossy printout of a flyer listing housing, rights and local assistance centers jammed into the door. There is a handwritten letter at the bottom for single mothers that you should read in order to comprehend Haley's circumstances. Signature, I crumpled it without asking for assistance, certainly not from them. I carelessly tossed it in the garbage, but I was beginning to notice the pattern, small, sporadic attacks tenacious enough to gradually wear me down. 2 weeks later, I definitely turned down the invitation to a family dinner this weekend. But when I opened my mailbox the following day, I discovered a flash drive with a film that Haley had recorded a stroll through my dad and Rebecca's crowded, chaotic flat, narrated with gentle grumbles like, since there isn't room for a crib. Rebecca must probably store her clothes in the corridor. Natalie isn't aware of how tight things are. I began to feel like the egotistical person who didn't grasp I hadn't heard from the person who declined to assist distant relatives. Began contacting me on Facebook since college, asking questions that seemed worried but obviously laden. Haley, I know it's difficult, but you're her sister, aren't you? Live alone in that house. Have you ever considered renting out space to assist family members? I didn't reply to anyone. Didn't need to clarify that the house wasn't extra space. Rather, it was a legacy left by my mother which I had spent years keeping up and safeguarding, and above all, it served as my last line of defense, the one spot where nobody was let to enter without authorization. One afternoon, I returned home to see a baby gift bag on the front doorstep. There was no note. No inside came a pregnancy journal, a cream-colored infant onesie, and my chest felt cold in an ultrasound picture, and they were vying for my attention. The most delicate and horrifying method of transforming my house into Hours, beginning by I realized then that if I didn't make a firm boundary, I'd be building mental landmines, ultimately lose everything I owned. I took the ultrasound picture out of the bag, and I looked at it. I didn't despise the infant, but I detested how the grown-ups in her life were treating her like a sacred object. When I called my dad and said, "I'm not moving out," to justify a modest invasion, coldly, and I would like that nothing more from your home appear at mine. This is the final time I will say it. He remained quiet for a long time before he let out a breath. "You can't hold on to the past indefinitely, Natalie?" "No," I answered. "I'm defending what my eye hung up after my mother left for me." On Tuesday night, I returned home from work and noticed a box on my porch with no message or return address. So I opened it to find 3 pastels, a box of newborn diapers, and brand new stroller tags still attached baby clothes. I gazed at the stroller on my porch as if it had a right to be there. I called my dad, shut the door, and went inside without touching anything. I texted, "Please remove Haley's belongings from my property," but got no response right away. I won't accept it if there is no response. But when I went to get the mail the following morning, the stroller was gone. I sighed, thinking perhaps they had finally understood that I was gullible. 3 days later, I heard strange voices as I was watering my backyard plants. I froze when I stepped around the front and saw my dad standing on my porch. Rebecca and an unknown woman. Holding a clipboard, she gave me a kind grin and spoke in a slick sales presentation. "Hello, Natalie. I'm Beth from your dad said you might need assistance looking at rental possibilities, so I interrupted her. Please, leave my porch," and she froze. My father moved nearer, speaking softly, "And we only wish to assist you, sweetie. This is a terrific chance to get something more comfortable. Make the proper decision. I don't need others to decide for me," I said. Tone as hard as steel. No one was invited to my house. Realtor here, I just stood there staring at them without saying anything else. Rebecca uttered a final sentence before they turned and headed back down the stairs. "We'll speak again soon." That evening, I added extra security cameras over her shoulder. I believed I had done enough to halt them, front and behind, but they were simply getting. When I left the workplace that evening just before 7:00 p.m., a chilly drizzle had began, and my only goal was to return home, curl up in a blanket, and forget about the day, but I attempted turning the lock after inserting my key. Once more, nothing happened. I took out the key and examined it. It was my house key. The side door was useless at that point, and my heart began to race with each beat. When I noticed a piece of paper taped to the window near the front entrance, my hands were shaking. The father replaced the "please give me a call" to discuss the locks for safety. I stood there motionless from the neck down. I took out my phone and called my dad. After 3 rings, he answered. "Hi. What the devil did you just do?" I snarled. "Don't get offended," and he responded as cool as ever. "It's Haley wants stability, but it's just temporary, and you've been under too much stress. Believed that everyone's lives would be made easier by this." I almost yelled. "You broke into my house, changed the locks, and evicted me. You know that's trespassing, so don't call. Don't make this a huge thing. It will just make the family seem bad." He hurried. "The cops." "Family?" I chuckled icily. "Real families don't behave this way. You have 3 hours to call a locksmith and reverse everything, or else I'll call the police and file a report." After a period of stillness, he eventually let out a weaker voice. "Okay, I'll take care of it." I waited for over 3 hours in my car. Locked on the door, a locksmith's vehicle arrived just after 10 p.m. No one from my family accompanied them. They were afraid to confront me again, but they had already gone too far, and I knew what would happen next. The law allowed me to return home, even though it might not be a key they would use. Like walking into a battleground, every door would require more than just a lock from now on. They had made it apparent that this was more than simply persuasion. Thus, it would require documentation, legal protection, and concrete proof. No longer. It was a deliberate attempt to steal what was rightfully mine. Following that evening, I still loved the house and thought it was the safest place in the world, but now I don't look at it the same way. Realized that it was under danger, and that danger came from the individuals I used to. I couldn't wait for them to end, so I called family. The following morning, I contacted a nearby security firm and asked for the installation of cameras and sensors for complete surveillance. Without hesitation, I spent the money for cloud storage and remote warnings. What I was, my mother put her trust in me, and it was more than simply property that needed to be protected. I then scheduled a consultation with Amanda Clean, a real estate lawyer. Suggested by a trustworthy co-worker, Amanda was in her early 40s, intelligent, and composed enough to quickly identify a legal loophole. So I told her everything from the courteous Amanda's recommendation to leave the emotional games and the unlawful lock change, listened intently, occasionally nodding as I took notes. When I was done, "Natalie, please get ready for what I'm about to do," she added, closing the folder. I tightened my hands on my lap and prepared to say, "Won't be easy." Amanda opened a printed paper. A scan of a legal consultation was taken out of a drawer. In the upper corner was my Thomas Harris as the father. 2 months ago, Mr. Harris got in touch with another law practice in Seattle, she claimed, and he asked if reclassification was an option. I became numb, Amanda, claiming that this house was family property due to a will error. Added, "They haven't formally filed anything, but the firm acknowledged that he sought legal counsel. He gave a copy of the house's deed and your mother's will." He had planned this all along, Amanda, so his stomach constricted. Nodding, this wasn't an impromptu change. The locks were only the surface. Was a months-long scheme, and every phone call that was disguised as every kind remark about family, every present left at my door, every strategic look, all of them served a purpose. They only needed me to be worn out, unsteady, and prepared. They didn't need my agreement. Amanda touched the file to give up. "Fortunately, your mother's will is airtight, legally notarized, observed, and unequivocally declared that they don't currently possess a strong legal argument. But if you don't move right away, they might retain pushing perhaps through family law avenues." I gave a slight nod, expressing how I felt. Was more than simply rage now. It was a combination of shock, grief, and a profound, painful sense of betrayal. My father, who taught me how to tie my shoes and once held the rear of my bike, had composedly planned how to remove the one thing my mother had left me, acting as though I was simply a barrier. He made no requests, made no offers of compromise, and only attempted to outwit me with legal wrangling, and Amanda meticulously outlined what to do next, confirming ownership, issuing a formal cease and desist, and initiating legal protections against unapproved reports that even though my hands were still trembling a little, I signed each page on the fingers clenched around the steering wheel. I stopped at a red light on the way home without turning on the radio. I simply looked into the rearview mirror as though attempting to catch a peek of my work. The young woman I once was, the one who continued to have faith in her father, the one who believed that blood held significance, but she had left, and I was aware of the rest. The conflict would be more than simply court filings and paperwork. It would pit me against individuals who were no longer worthy of being referred to as family. I hadn't heard from them in almost 2 months, but when the doorbell rang on a chilly, rainy Friday, I knew that the silence would not last. Dark, on a night that seemed to be the quiet before a storm, I looked at my dad, Rebecca, and Haley were visible on the phone's camera feed, this time with I didn't want to open the door, but I also didn't want to let them in with the newborn, in her arms, wrapped in a nice pink blanket. I opened it out of fear, keeping my eyes on the camera above the doorframe, but nobody spoke. Anything for the first few seconds, and the only sound to break the silence was the baby's slight coo in Haley's arms. Rebecca was the first to speak. I crossed my mind to communicate with Natalie, baby Juliet's big sister. Haley continued after giving birth 3 weeks ago, but I didn't allow them in. Requires family support and a peaceful setting. And because you're her sister. This isn't. Haley looked up no longer about a house, but more about a child's future. Arrogant, but she continued to hold the infant closer like a shield without expressing regret. My father looked at me with what appeared to be fatigued eyes, but I could tell he was behaving. He added that you don't have to forgive what happened. But you can still decide to... I did the correct thing by observing the 3 of them, each of whom was performing their role with its unique tone and strategy, but they were all focused on the same subject. They were only altering their approach, so I nodded. Slowly, okay, you've come this far. To be clear, I went outdoors. I don't have kids, but that doesn't mean I should draw the door halfway shut behind me. I mean, I have no idea what it's like to be a kid who has been betrayed. Rebecca attempted to interrupt, but, no, let me finish. My mother left me in this house, so I raised a hand. She did everything because she knew exactly what my father was like. Even in death, she was able to keep me safe. I stared directly at my parent, and in addition to failing me as a father, you attempted to make me into an obstacle. Did you think I wouldn't find out that you were prepared to sue me for stealing the house my mother left me? Despite his best efforts to remain calm, his face froze. Illy said quietly, I didn't. You've always received assistance ever since. I only need aid. Do you know anything about that? You're accustomed to being pampered since when you joined this family. Everyone put you first. Being protected, nevertheless, this house isn't a prize for the loudest crier, and looking down at the infant in her arms, Juliet, isn't an excuse for anyone. Rebecca's face heated when you invaded my house. You're being too obstinate. Although the 3 of you are abusing her, the infant hasn't done anything wrong. I cut in. I refuse to allow someone to exploit a child as a means of coercing me into abandoning my mother's legacy. I retreated from the doorknob. You're going to regret this, my father replied. Get off my property now. No, I said in a hushed voice. I'm doing what you ought to have completed a long time ago to safeguard my actual family. I shut the door, slammed it, and I phoned the police right away since my family is harassing me at home. They have already received written notice, but 10 minutes after they returned and attempted to exert psychological pressure, a patrol car drew up outside, but I didn't. As the officers spoke to them, I stood behind the curtain and watched through the glass. No, arguing no, I said. Scene of silent humiliation as the trio was compelled to depart. For the first time, slowly, that night, I no longer felt scared because I knew I was correct. To establish limits, and I wouldn't allow anyone to cross them again. I never heard a knock on my door again after the cops arrived, and there were no more handwritten messages requesting comprehension, no more baby things left as emotional cues, no more tardiness, night calls from unknown numbers. I knew this quiet was genuine, was the end. I had repeatedly warned them and given them opportunities to retreat, but they decided to push and manipulate in order to cross the line. Therefore, I now have to make a decision. Began by removing all communication, blocking my father, Rebecca, and Haley, as well as their secondary accounts that Haley had used to post mysterious, guilt-tripping messages, as well as changed my social media account's privacy settings so that no one could message or tag me unless they were a close friend. Every relationship I shared with my family was examined and approved. I didn't want anyone to mediate for me one by one, so I avoided whispers and moral lectures, such as, "You're still sisters, so why don't you sit down and talk?" I was no longer seated, and I was no longer conversing with those who used gossip to ease my suffering. Ambiguous guidance. One Saturday morning, I thoroughly cleaned and reorganized the entire house. Every picture frame in the corridor was cleaned, by my mother's library. But there was one that I hadn't dared to touch before. On the day I graduated from college, my mother was happy, and I had red eyes from. I reframed it and put it on my bedside table while fighting back tears. Nostalgia, but to always remind myself that I was once loved unconditionally, and I would respect that by I went back to work with a different attitude before I left, never bending, never giving up. Obligation. So I took a course on it and started making something. I opened a savings account in my mother's name with a fund designated especially for asset protection and estate planning. Repair the landscape she had originally planned but never completed. And I also got back in touch with people who had before criticized me for being too forceful, but now understood, why didn't I disclose all the details? I simply stated that I'm clearing out my life and letting go. Of what's no longer healthy, Lena, one of my best friends, said something that will always stick in my memory. Some doors don't close. I didn't detest Haley, and I wasn't upset with them because they close out of respect. Rebecca no longer, and I no longer thought my father would ever call to apologize. That was no longer necessary for healing. What I needed was clarity. Had limits. And now that I had them, I got a letter from my lawyer. The property's legal protections were completed, and the records were kept in 2 different places, with notifications in place in case someone attempted to submit a title change. Request for the residence. Despite being modest, I was suddenly surrounded by planning and determination that night. Played the jazz album my mother had cherished and lighted a tiny candle in the living room. No more footsteps I didn't trust. Just me, the house, and the silence I had battled for, with no more eyes on me. Despite all of my suffering and faith, I had no idea what the future might bring, yet I, living in my mother's home, I understood this much and wouldn't back down, but more than that, when she gave me the last key that spring, she lived as the lady she trusted. It wasn't because of the weather, but also because, for the first time in years, I felt lighter in my heart. Without worrying, I opened the living room window in the morning without checking the security. Cameras first thing. I wasn't anticipating. A menacing message wrapped in adorable Lena's nicest remarks on Saturday afternoon as I was watering the backyard. A buddy unexpectedly arrived with a big tote bag full of pastel cups and string lights. I laughed when I saw a handwritten letter, a housewarming party, and a restoration of harmony. Lena smirked. I've lived here for 6 years, so it's not a housewarming for the house. It's a housewarming for you, and I was at a loss for words. But yeah, we hosted a modest gathering the following weekend with just 6 guests. 2 close co-workers, Lena and my cousin and her husband, were visiting from Spokane, and my elderly neighbor once lent me a ladder to fix the roof. No one brought up my father, but nobody inquired about Haley or the child. They just discussed the lavender I grew, the way I painted the front door, and Lena's well-known, we ate in the backyard with string lights strung between 2 apple trees, and everyone asked for the recipe for the brownies. There was no posturing or pretending, just gentle laughter and talk among the trees. I had not allowed myself to believe what I saw as I looked around to be strong. I had never been alone before. I was simply placed in the wrong environment with the wrong people. I sat by myself on the patio after the party. I had a small shawl across my shoulders and a picture of my mother lying on a, "You see, Mom," I said in a whisper. I kept the little wooden table because I didn't need her to response. My fingertips felt the warmth of my chest. And later that. In the same month that I revised my own will, I left my fortune to trust. I gave the house to a neighborhood group, with one situation. In the event that a foster child required a location to start over, they would begin in this house, and I didn't do it to pass anything on. Took action to end the harmful cycle of expectations that generations. Because family isn't about blood. People used to manipulate one another in the name of family before us. Family is the one who knocks when you're afraid, the neighbor who brings over a can of tea, the friend who makes tea but remains silent when you cry paint because your door appears faded. My mother is a woman who put in a lot of effort to bone, and every time I enter this place, I just ever ask for kindness in return. feels solid anymore. Every morning cup of coffee feels light, and I'm not watching over the garden. Door. I'm truly living Natalie's narrative, not just watching over my shoulder. Tells us that respect cannot be replaced by blood ties, and that not everyone who calls themselves family deserves a place in our life. Being nice or setting appropriate limits might sometimes be important for preserving your house, memories, or tranquility. In a society where families are frequently used as weapons, how do we respect the dignity of those who came before us? It takes bravery to say no. What do you think of Natalie's choice? Would you have taken a different course of action in her position? Please share your opinions in the comments section and remember to follow the channel for more moving and inspiring tales of resiliency and family trust.